Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. We're back again today doing another video, continuing the Rise and Fall series that I've been doing. If you are unfamiliar, I've been doing a YouTube series called Rise and Fall, where I've been examining various NBA contenders throughout history, why they rose to be a contender, how they plateaued, and then how they ultimately started falling apart. And so if you want to check out the other videos, check out the playlist that this video is on. But today we'll be looking at the Grant Hill Pistons. Grant Hill was drafted by the Pistons in '94 and was a perennial All-Star with them until he left the team in 2000. So we'll be examining that era and how they became contenders and then started falling apart. So if you've never seen my videos before, real quick, the way that they're set up is I go season by season. I'll have some basic team statistics on the top left, like their record, what seed they were, their offense and defensive rankings, and then typically, like just on this page for a quick example, you'll have regular season stats on the left, playoff stats on the right, going back to this first season though. The stats I highlighted for individual players are games played, minutes per game, field goal attempts per game, and percentage. Same for three pointers and free throws. Then I have total rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, and points per game. So without further ado, this first season in which we had a rookie Grant Hill join the team, the main pieces of this team were him, along with an older Joe Dumars, who was early 30s at this point, pictured top right, and then Terry Mills, pictured bottom left, and Allen Houston. And it was basically those four and not much else on this team. As you can see below those four, there's not much else help on the team. Their offense was okay, but Terry Mills, I believe, was like a close to 6'10" and like a big man shooting around the rim, and for him to only be shooting essentially 45% from the field was pretty bad. Allen Houston wasn't really like the perennial all-star Allen Houston we think of yet either. He was good, but still coming into his own. Joe Dumars was just basically at the end of his prime here and about to fall out of it, and Grant Hill was still a rookie, still trying to kind of find his way, but did have a really good rookie year, putting up 20 points, 6 rebounds, 5 assists. Going into their next season, 95 to 96, they improved quite a bit and were actually able to make the playoffs. Their offense jumped up a good amount, but their defense as well really, really improved. And that can be attributed, the good defense, to really, I would say, Grant Hill, Joe Dumars. Otis Thorpe was a pretty good defensive player who, as you can see, they had brought in here for this season. Um, Theo Ratliff also played for them, sort of like a backup center role, and he was pretty good defensively as well. Grant Hill took a big step up statistically as far as rebounds. I think he went, as we saw in the last slide, he was at 6 rebounds a game, and now he jumped up to a little, basically 10 rebounds per game, and 7 assists, which is really good as well. Allen Houston also took a really big jump offensively, up to 20 points per game, and Otis Thorpe was a pretty good low post presence for them as well. And they got to the playoffs as the 7th seed and lost to the Shaq Penny Magic in the first round. And really, if you look at the playoffs and why they fell off a bit, there's not a clear discernible reason from the statistics necessarily, but I think it really just comes down to, Shaq and Penny were just a better duo at this point than Allen Houston and Grant Hill. Like, Grant Hill was pretty good, so actually Houston was really good in this series as well, but I think the Magic just had more supporting pieces. Like they had the Nick Anderson, Dennis Scott, Horace Grant, Brian Shaw. That was a much better supporting cast than at this point Dumars, Otis Thorpe, Mark West, and Lindsey Hunter. Um, and so to me, that's really the reason that they weren't able to keep pace with Orlando in that series. Going into their next season, we saw a big jump up from the offense, getting up to fifth, and the defense is still pretty solid at 11th. And this is actually the best record that this Pistons team had, which is 54 wins. And people always say the East was so weak historically, but this year we had a 54 win team in the East who wasn't even a top 4 seed. They're actually the 5th seed. You had Atlanta with 56 wins, New York with 57, Miami with 61, and Chicago with 69. So this was a pretty stacked year in the East. Grant Hill to date had his best statistical season, 21, 9, and 7. Joe Dumars had a pretty decent season with 15 points. Lindsey Hunter stepped up quite a bit with 14. And then you had the Terry Mills Otis Thorpe duo still providing serviceable fringe starter slash good role player support for this team. They had lost Allen Houston to New York at this point, where he had gone in free agency, I believe, after his rookie deal had expired. And if you want to look at why this team lost to Atlanta, I think it really boils down to Joe Dumars playing pretty awful in the playoffs, along with a few other people. Like, Grant Hill didn't play bad, but his efficiency did drop a bit from about 50% from the field to under 44%. Other than that, I would really attribute those two, like their two best offensive players, basically not playing great. And, the Atlanta Hawks had a really long, good defenders in Dikembe Mutombo and Steve Smith. And Dikembe Mutombo provided a lot of rim protection, so Grant Hill and Dumars weren't able to drive the lane as easily and had a lot more trouble in there. And so that really stifled them. And then you had like long wing defenders, especially I'm thinking Steve Smith, who is able to help defend those guys consistently, and a pretty defensive minded team in Atlanta as well. So all those factors combined to stop Detroit. But this was a really good Detroit team, and they were pretty close to advancing. As you can see, they only lost in the final game of the series, and they probably would have just gotten stomped by Chicago in the second round. But um, all the same, they were a pretty solid team. So now we get into 70, 97 to 98, and this is actually still a pretty good team. And as you'll see, their offense and defensive ratings were actually still really good, like respectively. And I looked up, and they're actually, based on their statistics from this season, their expected win-loss record was actually 46 and 36, but they finished 37 and 45, basically just because they had a ton of close games, and they were super unlucky, and they lost a ton of them that they really would have been expected to win, but just like in the last couple minutes, they choked them away. If you look at this team up and down statistically, pictured bottom left, you have Bison Dele, who came in and basically had his best year of his career, averaging 16 and 9 on good efficiency. You had a young Jerry Stackhouse coming in from Philadelphia, who was averaging 16 points a game, playing pretty well. Um, I believe, yeah, they had acquired him in exchange for Theo Ratliff, who they sent to Philly. Other guys who were pretty good on this team, you had Dumars, still a decent supporting player. At this point, I think he's like 34, 35-ish, getting older, but still a decent supporting player. And Lindsey Hunter putting up 12 points a game, but on terrible efficiency. And Grant Hill having a pretty standard 21 points, 8 rebounds, 7 assists, 2 steals season. But like, this was kind of a transition year, I think, in the Pistons time frame, because you had Dumars kind of taking a step back, and then you had Stackhouse kind of rising to become the real second option here. Going into the 98 to 99 season, pictured top right, you have Lindsey Hunter again. And I pictured him at top right because I think he was really somebody who I attribute them failing in the playoffs to. Again, they were the 5 seed. This was the lockout shortened year, and if you adjust their record to what it would have been in a regular season, they would have been 48 and 34. They again faced the 4 seed Atlanta Hawks in the first round. Again, had a very good offense and defensive rating, led by a really good season from Grant Hill again, putting up his 21, 7, and 6. Dumars pretty much at the end of his career here, only putting up 11 points a game. Stackhouse putting up around 15 again. Bison Dele took a bit of a step back, only averaging around 10.5 points and 6 rebounds this year, but still overall a pretty good team. And you'll see at the bottom, on the left, you actually had the addition of Christian Laettner late in the year, um, playing a handful of games for the team, providing some good bench depth. And that's a little bit why Bison Dele's stats were down, was because they had Laettner who could spell some of that time for him. But the reason I pictured Lindsey Hunter here top right was because I think if you look at on the right at his playoff stats, that really is a huge factor of why this team failed in playoffs. He was taking the second most shots on this team in the playoffs, and he's shooting 26% from the field, which is really atrocious. And I am curious at why their coaching at one point didn't just say, Lindsey, you're not shooting the rest of the game, and because after the first 2 games of shooting so atrocious, you'd think that they would just tell him you're not shooting, but he still shot and basically shot them out of the series, in my opinion. Grant Hill played fine. Joe Dumars played fine. Stackhouse played relatively poor for himself. 10 points a game, under 40% from the field. So really, Christian Leitner there too as well, playing decent actually for them. To me, it comes down to mainly Lindsey Hunter failing them, but then also to a lesser extent Jerry Stackhouse underperforming as well. And then we got the last season here of this run that we're looking at, 99 to 2000. You got Stackhouse playing really well, Grant Hill playing really well. Those two guys combined are putting up basically 50 points a game. And you have Lindsey Hunter probably putting up the best season of his career, actually. 13 points a game on relatively good shooting for him, 43% from the field about. Christian Leitner having a little bit of a bounce back season for himself, putting up 12 points, 7 rebounds. They had lost Joe Dumars to retirement at this point. They actually weren't that great as far as a record, and I attribute that to no more Bison Dele and Joe Dumars retiring. And basically, when your top 4 guys are including like a 34-year-old Christian, or actually not 34, but about a 30-year-old Christian Leitner who's past his prime, and Lindsey Hunter, who on his best day should really be like a seventh man. That's pretty worrisome. In the playoffs, you'll see Grant Hill actually sustained an injury, so it was kind of a wash in the playoffs this year. But Stackhouse played okay, and Lindsey Hunter, again, his efficiency fell off a cliff, shooting 31% from the field in the playoffs. Stackhouse not shooting great either, only 41%, but he was never a super efficient player either. And that was really this whole team, guys. And I have Christian Leitner top right, and it feels really weird to see him in a Pistons outfit to me, but he actually played pretty bad in the playoffs too. Only 7 points a game on 41% from the field. Um, and if I had to boil down why this Detroit team really failed, I would say it was because they didn't necessarily do what I would call a proper rebuild, in that you look at like the seasons where they were trying to contend with both Dumars and um, Grant Hill, they didn't really commit to one or the other as far as like a youth movement or like going all in on veterans, because you see this team their first year really contending with both guys. You have like a 22-year-old Grant Hill, like a 23-year-old Allen Houston, paired up with like a 32-year-old Dumars and like a 33-year-old Otis Thorpe. And that was just a really weird contrast of like your top 4 guys being at the tail ends of either side of their careers. Then they let Allen Houston go, which was a really weird choice, and basically don't replace him with anybody, which was very odd to me. And again, you kind of just have this like 24-year-old Grant Hill hanging out with like a 33-year-old Joe Dumars, and they just didn't really set the team up for like long-term success with having a really contrasting roster. And then also, um, they tried to bring in Stackhouse, who was a pretty good addition for a time, but this team really lacked depth, and I don't want to keep blaming the front office, but that was somewhat of an issue, in that outside of Grant Hill, they actually had a pretty bad roster when you consider like Joe Dumars was like already past his prime by the time that Grant Hill came along. Lindsey Hunter really is like the third option on most of these teams, and on any good team, he should be like, as I was saying earlier, a seventh man probably. And guys like Terry Mills and Otis Thorpe and Christian Leitner, even when he came along, and even Bison Dele, they were really like guys who should at best be like sixth men, and they were looked at as like unquestionable starters for these teams. So yeah, I would say lack of depth is a second issue, and then a third issue I would just attest to basically a lot of inefficient volume scorers on this team who come the playoffs performed a lot worse because defenses lock in a lot more. So guys like Stackhouse and Lindsey Hunter, who are really inefficient scorers, just struggled mightily in the playoffs overall. So there you have it, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you keep checking out the series, and I will see you next time. Bye.